Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the History of Elections in America. Episode 7, Berkeley's Virginia. Last time, we talked about the unwinding of the English Civil War as the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell failed and was replaced by a restored monarchy under Charles II. Both Maryland and Virginia were largely returned to the status quo. Lord Baltimore had successfully fended off numerous attacks on his control of Maryland, and in Virginia the royalist William Berkeley had been restored to the governorship. Things will become unsettled again soon enough in the Chesapeake, but since the region is calm for the moment, I thought it would be a good idea to step back from the narrative and talk about Virginia's development during the second half of the 17th century, with a bit of an emphasis on its political culture. In particular, I'd like to show how both the geography of the region and the developing social hierarchy affected Virginia's political system. I think that the most important thing to note is that as the colony matured, it became not more but less democratic, just like in Maryland last episode. In its early years, Virginia had been open, both economically and politically. But as a new elite formed, and as the class of indentured servants was slowly replaced by a caste of slaves, Virginia reverted to more restrictive norms like in England. Note that as we talk about life in Virginia, it's safe to assume that life in Maryland was in most ways quite similar. Maryland was smaller, and it had had a later start, plus it was politically unstable at the top, but that didn't affect daily life so much, at least not most of the time. Tobacco was at the center of everything in the Chesapeake. The needs of planting, harvesting, and curing set the pace of daily life. Repeated attempts over the last several decades by the government to diversify the economy into such commodities as, quote, silk, flax, hemp, iron, rice, pitch, and tar, had all failed more or less completely. Tobacco was the Chesapeake's comparative advantage. There was just way more money to be made in planting it than in doing anything else, and no other reason to risk Virginia's high death rate. So tobacco plantations kept springing up all across the region, further and further up the rivers. Settlements in the Chesapeake were extremely spread out for a number of reasons. Obviously, a big plantation needs a lot of space. But also important was the fact that the Chesapeake Bay is fed by 48 different navigable rivers, from the James to the Potomac. It was far easier to get around on water than on land, so there was less of a need for towns to act as central hubs for transportation and communication. If you had a plantation, it was often simpler and cheaper for you to just build a dock on your land and have traders come upriver to you. Also, no doubt, settlers were looking for the most fertile land, wherever that was. Add to that people buying up extra land in the hopes of farming it later, or moving to a more remote location in the hopes of buying more land later, and you can see why the Chesapeake was as rural as it was. In fact, the Native Americans were more urbanized than the English settlers at the time. Jamestown was the only settlement that could plausibly be called a city, and while I couldn't find a good population estimate for it at this time, it couldn't have held more than a few thousand people at best. Remember that the population of Virginia only reached 40,000 in the 1670s, and Maryland had maybe some 10,000 plus people on top of that. As a result of this geographic dispersion, county governments wound up responsible for most of the day-to-day administration in the colony. Local justices of the peace could pass laws pretty much as they wished. Courts were established in the counties, although they weren't just courts in the modern sense. In addition to judicial functions, they also had executive/administrative responsibilities as well. They handled most routine legal matters, from recording land ownership to the care of orphans to the regulation of taverns. Basically, all of the features of local government were rolled up into a single body. It was all quite simple and unspecialized relative to the complexity of modern government. And remember, none of these men were elected. The militia was run at the county level except in times of emergency, and sheriffs handled many of the basic functions of local government, serving warrants, collecting taxes, things like that. They were given a cut of the revenue they brought in, so it could pay quite well. Most importantly for us, they were responsible for running elections. So let me take a moment to go into a bit more detail about how elections were held in practice. Of course, Governor Berkeley didn't call for elections from 1661 to 1676, so it's a moot point for now, but this should give you an idea of how things went before and after that interlude. The process began when the governor decided to call for an election. Orders were then issued and given to the sheriff of each county. It was his responsibility to inform the populace of the upcoming election's place and time. In the early decades of the colony, he would literally go door to door around the county. But this was unwieldy and ineffective, and people kept complaining that they didn't actually find out about the election until it was too late. So in the 1660s, the process was changed. Now sheriffs were required to have the minister in each county read an announcement in church 2 Sundays in a row before the election, since that was the one place everyone would be. The exact time and place of elections wasn't specified by law. The sheriff could choose as he thought best, although elections had to be held at least 20 days after the writ was delivered, to make sure that everyone could be informed in time. Generally, elections would have been held in whatever the typical meeting place of the county was, at the courthouse most likely. It probably varied by county, but the standard practice may have been to hold one voting session in the morning and one in the afternoon. To make sure that people weren't afraid to attend, it was forbidden for the sheriff to arrest people on election day, except for felonies or immediate breach of the peace. Incidentally, sheriffs were also forbidden from arresting people at church to keep attendance from dropping. There was no formal method of nominating candidates, people just announced that they were in the running. And remember that at this time, each county sent 2 burgesses to the assembly, so you could vote twice in each election. Sometimes candidates campaigned, sometimes not, depending on how secure they felt. Back in episode 3, I talked about the increasing political awareness in England as voters became more informed and candidates learned to get votes by campaigning on issues. This was only slowly becoming the case in the Chesapeake. For now, such political factions as there were more about personal conflicts and competition for lucrative offices than about policy. I think it's safe to say that the atmosphere at these elections may have been, if not always festive, then at least convivial. It would have been as much a social occasion as a political one. Sometimes candidates tried to bribe voters by offering them, quote, meat, drink, entertainment, and provision, which we know because the assembly had to ban the practice in the early 1700s. So this would have been an occasion quite unlike most elections today, and I can only imagine how drunk people got. I mentioned back in episode 3 that both in England and in Virginia the custom was to vote by voice or by show of hands rather than by ballot, and that was still the case. As elections at this time weren't so fiercely contested, it was possible for voting to be so informal, with no proper counts taken. Later on, if there was a closely fought election, the sheriffs would record formal vote tallies, but that wouldn't be for another few decades. For now, I suspect that at most, if there was some dispute, sheriffs or their clerks simply marked out rough counts, tally marks perhaps, and left it at that. Once the sheriff had determined who the winners of the election were, he sent word back to the General Assembly. And that was that. Any complaints about the election could be sent to the Assembly as well, and it was they who would decide the issue. It was a very simple system, one quite vulnerable to abuse and manipulation. Obviously, without a secret ballot, everyone knew who you voted for. One of the reasons given for restricting the franchise to men who owned land was that they were the only ones with enough independence to not just vote how someone else wanted them to. And there were no real procedures in place to prevent cheating. But I'm not at all certain that this was a problem for the leaders of Virginia. They preferred a system that was predictable and controllable. And while they believed that representation was a useful feature of government, it wasn't of foundational importance. Seats in the House of Burgesses weren't too highly coveted yet either. Not all seats were campaigned for, as I mentioned, and turnover was still very high, partly due to the high death rate. For instance, in a given assembly in Maryland, almost half of the members that year would be first-timers. This only changed after around 1689 or so. So inexperienced burgesses often came and went without having much of an impact. I should re-emphasize that the burgesses were the only elected officials in Virginia for its whole colonial history. Every other position was appointed. In practice, however, the appointees needed to be approved by the notable men of a given county, and the burgesses themselves now tended to come from the higher ranks of society. So government, both local and central, was hardly going to be too responsive to the needs of the average indentured servant or even freeman. Instead, it was all about the growing upper class. During the English Civil War, Governor Berkeley had invited well-born royalists displaced by the conflict to settle in Virginia. A few of these cavaliers came, and more upper-class Englishmen trickled in over the next few decades. Most of these men hadn't actually been proper cavaliers, that is, supporters of the king during the Civil War, but they came to call themselves cavaliers anyway, and their self-image would turn into the self-image of Virginia's upper class as a whole. They understood themselves to be dashing aristocrats and superior men. It wasn't a large migration, but it had an outsized impact on the highest levels of Virginia's social ladder. Quote, of 72 families in Virginia's high elite whose dates of migration are known, 2/3 arrived between 1640 and 1669. That's from Albion's Seed by David Hackett Fisher, a fascinating book that contrasts the various cultures of settlers in colonial America. I'll be drawing on it for this episode. These immigrants were often second sons of important families, who stood to inherit nothing and so left for the New World to start new lives for themselves. They were in general richer than the migrants who had come before, and so they were able to purchase larger estates. In the 1630s, a typical member of the council had from 300 to 500 acres of land, and remember that you could get 50 acres of land just by showing up. So back then, the wealthier was certainly wealthier, but there was no immense gulf between the top and everyone else. The new Cavaliers, however, came from much richer stock. They could easily control estates of tens of thousands of acres. They didn't totally displace the old elite, but they did tend to dominate it. This new elite heavily intermarried and turned itself into somewhat of a de facto aristocracy. For generations to come, it would be these men and their descendants, called the first families of Virginia, although they weren't actually first, who would dominate Virginia politics. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and several other presidents all came from these families. So did Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. The first families established themselves quickly and they came to dominate the government. According to Fisher, quote, of 152 Virginians who held top offices in the late 17th and early 18th century, at least 16 were connected to aristocratic families, and 101 were the sons of baronets, knights, and the rural gentry of England. 7 more came from armigerous urban families, with coats of arms at the College of Heralds. Only 18 were the sons of yeomen, traders, mariners, artisans, or plebs. None came to Virginia as laborers or indentured servants. Indeed, the governor's council itself became almost hereditary. Again, according to Fisher, quote, as early as 1660, every seat on the council was filled by members of 5 related connections. As late as 1775, every member of that august body was descended from a councillor who had served in 1660. From 1680 to independence, 2/3 of the seats were held by members of just 25 families. And remember, these were the men picking all the other office holders in the colony. It never became a genuine hereditary aristocracy, but it came close enough. I think you can start to understand why Virginia was shifting towards restrictions on voting around this time. On the other hand, politics in Maryland were generally less hereditary. Only 26 out of 137 assemblymen from 1661 to 1689 had sons who went on to be elected themselves. And even at the higher levels of government, only 2 councilors out of 28 had sons who became councilors themselves. However, even if Maryland's politics were less hereditary, they did reflect the growing inequality in the colony. Fewer delegates were illiterate and fewer were simple planters. Lawyers, merchants, and entrepreneurs became more common in government. The upper class still dominated, but there were fewer members, so the process was just more muted than in Virginia, and the voting restrictions in both colonies were very similar. This new elite in Virginia had a rather earthy culture, filled with farming, animal husbandry, gambling, hunting, cockfighting, sex, and ever-present death. It was a peculiar mix of liberality and harsh discipline, looseness and self-control. If you think about the lifestyle of a Roman aristocrat before total decadence set in, you wouldn't be too far off, and the Virginians themselves noticed the parallels. They aspired to a Roman sort of liberty, that of the leisured gentleman, who was free to make demands of his social inferiors, but also free from social superiors who could make demands of him. This hierarchical sort of freedom could by definition only be enjoyed by a few wealthy men. In the words of one Virginian, quote, I am an aristocrat. I love liberty. I hate equality. The society of the first families was hierarchical, patriarchal, and honor-bound. It was not too concerned with education. Most high-class men could read and write, but few men from the lower classes and few women from any class were literate. Massachusetts had set up Harvard in the 1630s, but Virginia hardly had any primary schools. Virginia didn't even have a printing press until the 1730s. At one point, Governor Berkeley wrote in a letter, quote, I thank God there are no free schools nor printing, and I hope we shall not have these for 100 years, for learning has brought disobedience and heresy into the world, and printing has divulged them. God keep us from both. Needless to say, the betterment of the lower classes was not a high social priority. So, what about those lower classes? How did the rest of Virginia live? Not that well, as it turns out. Fisher divides Virginia into 3 main social classes. The first, the elite planters I've been describing, made up perhaps 10% of the population, and according to him, quote, owned 50 to 75% of productive assets in the colony. Within this group, the first families were the elite of the elite. Below them were the yeomen, farmers who owned their own land and maybe had a servant or 2. This group was 20 to 30% of the population and would have made up a majority of the voters. A yeoman family might be rich enough to own a few books, if that. Life for a yeoman could be precarious. A bad year could land them permanently in debt to a wealthier neighbor. The rest of the colonists, the majority, were landless. These men were tenant farmers, or below them indentured servants, or below them slaves. From people who had no property down to people who were property. More than 3/4 of immigrants came to Virginia as indentured servants. Of these servants, more than 3/4 were men between the ages of 15 and 24, and immigration to Virginia overall was over 80% male. Most of these men were illiterate and unskilled farmers from the somewhat lower class in England, just a few rungs up from the bottom. At this point, most of the good land had been bought up, so it was no longer possible to just claim your 50 acres of land once you'd finished your indenture. You could head out to the frontier, but that was risky. So most new arrivals remained landless. These young and avaricious men created about this sort of society you'd expect. In my research for the podcast, I've seen Virginia at this time described as a Wild West town, a boom town, and a logging town. In other words, young, male, violent, and unsettled. Conditions in Virginia weren't conducive to forming families, even apart from the skewed sex ratio. Only half of babies would survive until adulthood, and of those children who did reach 18, over 3/4 would have lost one or both parents. So there were few families, few children, few old people. And the population kept expanding thanks to new arrivals who kept the gender and age balance out of whack. These young men were of course not likely to be too politically active, even if servants had been allowed to vote. And in fact, basically no servants became politicians. Quote, "Not a single indentured servant who arrived after 1640 appears to have won a seat in the assembly before 1706. Even more remarkably, quote, apparently none of the burgesses from 1660 to 1706 was descended from indentured servants who emigrated after 1640. That's from Fisher quoting historian Martin Quitt. So even if servitude was better than life in England, it was no longer a route to high status in Virginia. That path was closed. I'd like to end this episode by discussing the origins and legal underpinnings of both indentured servitude and slavery. Obviously, slavery will become extraordinarily important to the history of Virginia and the United States as a whole, but I've avoided talking about it so far. While there were African slaves in Virginia from a very early date, for many decades the number was quite small, and their legal status somewhat uncertain. In the first half-century of English settlement, indentured servants were far more important. And slavery in large measure grew out of the tradition of servitude in the Chesapeake. Indentured servitude has its origins in the apprenticeship system in 16th century England. Under this system, an apprentice would contract with a master, offering him some years of service without pay in exchange for being taught a trade. However, this wasn't a simple internship. The master had nearly total control over the apprentice's personal life. Apprentices couldn't marry, and they had to follow all their master's orders. They were more servants than employees. And importantly, apprenticeship contracts could be bought and sold, so an apprentice could wind up working for a different master than the one he'd signed up with. But this was a regulated process, and there was no big market for the labor of apprentices. The arrangement was temporary, and apprentices could get out of their contracts if their master was abusive, or if he wasn't fulfilling his end of the bargain in teaching them a trade. No doubt the system was quite biased in favor of the master, but it was less openly mercenary than servitude in Virginia. From the start, things in Virginia were different. For one thing, rather than working in exchange for learning a trade, indentured servants worked for several years in exchange for free passage to Virginia, and for the hope of getting land in the future. So while an apprenticeship was an unequal and unfree relationship, it was one with traditional norms and expectations that regulated behavior. And the apprentice and the master had to live and work side by side. None of that was true with indentured servitude. Servitude was much more purely economic, and it was crueler as a result. Servants who ran away repeatedly were branded. Female servants who got pregnant were lashed, and their indenture was extended by 2 years to compensate their master for the time lost by having a child. Some masters would try to impregnate their servants just to get the extra years of labor. Masters had no incentive to treat their servants well. They were disposable, and so abuse was rife. In one particularly extreme case, 2 servants, a woman named Elizabeth Abbott and a man named Elias Hinton, were beaten repeatedly and savagely by their masters, a husband and wife, until they both died. At one point, the woman was lashed 500 times in a row. When she ran away, her neighbors promptly returned her to her masters. There were laws against aiding runaway servants. After her death, her body was examined and found to be, quote, full of sores and holes, very dangerously wronkled and putrefied, both above her waist and upon her hips and thighs. And yet there is no record that their masters were ever punished. This was an unusually cruel case. Masters generally wanted their servants alive at least, but it was still an indicative one. Servants were property, for as long as their indenture held. According to Warren M. Billings, servants were, quote, exchanged as commodities, were used as security in debt proceedings, and frequently formed portions of marriage settlements or inheritances. According to Edmund S. Morgan, when a Dutch sea captain came to Virginia in the 1630s, he was shocked to see, quote, players gambling at cards with their servants as stakes. I think it's very, very easy to see how this mindset led quite easily and naturally to full-on slavery. Virginia was culturally prepared for slavery well before slavery began in earnest. Workers no longer owned their own labor. Workers were now a commodity. There wasn't a free market for labor, I should point out. The General Assembly passed regulations mandating minimum terms of service and things like that, so as to keep the servant class more dependent and less mobile, by weakening their ability to bargain. So why did people keep coming to Virginia as indentured servants if mortality was so high and the working conditions so awful? Well, the truth is that if you survived, there was real money to be made. After your contract was up, you'd be your own man again. Many people did in fact decide that coming to Virginia as a servant was a worthwhile gamble. Few became rich planters, but many wound up doing better in Virginia than they would have in England at least. The same could not be said of the slaves, however. Slavery has been a recurring feature of civilization for thousands of years, but the form it took in the Americas, race-based and transmitted from generation to generation, was unique. When the Europeans began conquering the Americas, they at first relied upon native labor, but that proved insufficient. Not enough Europeans wanted to come, and so the conquistadors turned to Africa to fill the gap. There had long been a small slave trade in West Africa, mainly selling off prisoners of war. The Europeans began buying these slaves and shipping them to the Americas. As the demand for African slaves increased, the supply rose to match, and slave raids began to consume West Africa, destabilizing the region. By the time Jamestown was settled, there were already 250,000 black slaves in Spanish and Portuguese America. Slavery in British America began in the Caribbean, and from there slowly spread to what would become the United States. Not only to the Chesapeake, but to New England as well. So the development of slavery in Virginia and Maryland should be no surprise, since all the other Europeans in the Americas were already importing black slaves. The first recorded shipment of slaves to Virginia arrived in 1619, a decade after its founding. John Rolfe, husband to Pocahontas and the first grower of tobacco in the colony, noted that a Dutch ship had brought, quote, 20 and odd Negroes to Jamestown. It's likely, though not certain, that there may have been a handful of Africans in the colony before that date. In the beginning, the importation of slaves was haphazard, a shipment here, a shipment there. The English weren't dominant in the slave trade at the time, and there were too few buyers in the Chesapeake to make regular trade in slaves worthwhile. Indentured servitude made more sense on these small plantations of the time, and there was a more ready supply of them. In 1625, there were only 23 blacks in Virginia, and in 1640 there were only 20 in Maryland. From there, the slave trade slowly accelerated, surpassing the flow of indentured servants only towards the end of the 1600s. According to Bernard Bailyn in his book The Barbarous Years, quote, by 1650 there were 300 blacks in Maryland, in 1660, 758, and in 1670, 1,190, 9% of the population, by which time Virginia's black population had reached 2,000, which was maybe 5% of the population. Not all Africans who came to the Chesapeake were slaves, though probably a large majority were. Some were more like indentured servants and were given their freedom after a few years of service. A few may have even been free. However, blacks were considered slaves until proven otherwise. Slaves could sometimes win their freedom, and when free they could own property and even sue in court with a chance of winning. Bailyn gives the example of Northampton County, Virginia, where, quote, in 1668, nearly a third of the 59 blacks, all of whom had arrived bound in unlimited servitude, had acquired freedom. But that was atypical. In general, slaves and other blacks occupied an ambiguous legal position in those first decades. Slavery wasn't clearly distinguished from servitude yet, but it was by no means prohibited. Slaves were essentially just indentured servants whose contracts were unending. There were some laws that discriminated along racial lines, but nothing systematic yet. For instance, the General Assembly didn't explicitly ban free blacks from voting until well into the 1700s. There's apparently no evidence that any black freeholders did in fact ever vote in Virginia, but it's not actually impossible. We do know, for instance, that later on in South Carolina, a few free blacks voted, even after they had been banned from doing so. So it's at least possible that in Virginia at least a few blacks voted at one time or another, we just don't know. But racial prejudice definitely did exist in Virginia at an early date, if not in any fully thought-out way. For instance, in 1630, a white man was, quote, soundly whipped before an assembly of Negroes and others for abusing himself to the dishonor of God and shame of Christians, by defiling his body and lying with a Negro. The antipathy went beyond mere distrust of foreigners. Africans were seen by the English as savage and lesser, a separate people you shouldn't mix with too closely. Hence the abhorrence of interracial sex from so early on. Not that that stopped people from intermingling in practice, of course. While racism encouraged legislators to sharpen the distinction between white and black, economic motives encouraged them to sharpen the distinction between servant and slave. Quite simply, there was a lot of money to be made if you owned the right to someone else's labor for life. And slaves were hardly in a position to fight for their rights in a culturally alien land. So step by step, law by law, the Chesapeake turned itself into a slave society. In 1664, the Maryland Assembly passed a brief bill titled, quote, An Act Concerning Negroes and Other Slaves, which made explicit that all blacks were to serve for life and that their children would be enslaved as well. Even mixed-race children were to be enslaved. The legal reasoning underlying slavery would be refined over time, but the basic logic is already clear to see. Slavery was becoming the heritable status of a new racial caste. Ambiguities like mixed-race children were dealt with in a way that preserved the long-term interests of the planters. In 1667, the Virginia Assembly made it clear that baptizing slaves wasn't enough to free them. Later, violence by a master against a slave was legalized, up to and including murder. Interracial marriage between both whites and blacks and whites and Native Americans was banned, on pain of expulsion from the colony. I've already mentioned that aiding runaway servants was a crime, so that was easily extended to slaves. Full-on slave codes didn't really appear until the 1700s, but the progression towards them was straightforward and was never really challenged. In the words of Warren Billings, it happened, quote, gradually but not haphazardly. I suppose it wasn't inevitable for the American South to become a slave society in the way it did, but it's also hard to see how it could have been avoided. There was money to be made in slavery, and there was a visible racial divide on which you could build a caste system. There was a pre-existing transatlantic slave trade. Moving from a system of apprenticeship to one of servitude and then of slavery was natural. The Virginians were merely expanding the market in unfree labor as far as it could go. And racism was present in the Chesapeake from the beginning, making the whole process easier. So, right as Virginia was gaining a new overclass, it was also gaining a new underclass, and its political structure evolved to match. The new upper class marginalized everyone else. Most Virginians were barred from voting, and few could rise high enough to dream of running for office. The earlier, more egalitarian period can be seen in hindsight as an anomaly, just an artifact of a colony that was still developing politically. Now that Virginia was growing and stabilizing, it was coming to more closely resemble England's lesser political openness. And lurking below everything, ever more important and ever more threatening, was slavery. William Berkeley himself wasn't the main cause of all this, but it is the legacy of his time in office. On the next episode of Early and Often, that time in office will come to a dismal end. All of the tensions that have been building in Virginia will explode into open revolt. By the end, Jamestown will be in ruins, and the government nearly overthrown. This episode will wrap up our time in the Chesapeake for now, so join me next time as everything comes crashing down in the tumult of Bacon's Rebellion. And if you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.